Hello friends, this is Channel 24 on YouTube. It's May 28th. I'm Yuri Gavryshchak, and we'll discuss the latest news as of Wednesday evening. Before we start, please like the video. This helps promote Ukrainian content and push back pro-Russian narratives. Main topics. Russian airports are still dealing with the aftermath of Ukrainian drone strikes, and there are reports of precise hits on military-industrial sites. Putin has made new ceasefire demands, though this isn't the first time. Meanwhile, US senators are urging Russians to revolt against the regime. Now, regarding May 27 to 28, Russian authorities claim to have intercepted or destroyed 296 drones, but these reports are likely exaggerated.
По території країни-агресора було випущено низку безпілотників. І російське Міноборони відзвітувало про перехоплення або знищення майже 300. А якщо бути точним, то 296 БПЛА начебто були знешкоджені. Ну, це байки від російського Міноборони і не більше.
Andriy Kovalenko of the National Security and Defense Council said microchips are made at this tech park. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed drones were shot down over 12 regions, including Moscow, Bryansk, Belgorod, Voronezh, Kursk, and Ryazan. Moscow Mayor Sobyanin said 33 drones were downed near the White House, but not all were stopped. Zelenograd's Elma Tech Park was hit, damaging buildings involved in drone guidance and control. I'll show you footage of the fire today.
Як це все палало сьогодні, зараз продемонструю. І, власне, як розповів у себе в телеграм-каналі керівник Центру протидії дезінформації при РНБО українському Андрій Коваленко, на території цього технопарку виготовляють мікрочіпи.
It is also known that there was a hit on an enterprise in the Moscow region town of Dubna, which has been part of the Kronstadt concern since 2020. The main profile of the enterprise is the production of combat drones, in particular the Aryan complex, which tourists themselves call an analog of the Turkish Bayraktar. There was also damage in Chekhov near Moscow, another village, where 3 residential buildings were damaged by debris. Sorry for the tautology. There were no casualties, and the so-called authorities there reported that. Let me remind you that this is one of the largest attacks by Ukrainian drones since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of our territory, and the largest drone attack by the armed forces of Ukraine, according to the Ministry of Defense, took place on the night of March 11th, when 343 Ukrainian drones were allegedly shot down. Now the number is 296, so let's record these figures. Later in the afternoon, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that the military-industrial complex had been hit. In particular, in Dubno, a separate SBU unit hit the Raduga plant, which produces cruise missiles of various classes, air-to-air, air-to-ground, and ground-to-ground. And among the products of the Raduga plant are X-101 and X-69 missiles, which, let me remind you, are used by the Russian Federation to launch tourist attacks and hit Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. There is also information from the General Staff that today unmanned aerial vehicle units hit the Engstrom company, which is also located in Zelenograd, Moscow region. The company develops and manufactures microelectronics that are widely used by the military-industrial complex of the Russian Federation, and there is evidence that in 2024, the company supplied 18 Russian defense plants at once. By the way, I will now demonstrate a video that is gaining immense popularity in Russian publics and has become a viral one. A resident of the Moscow region is either shouting at the drones or addressing Vladimir Putin with a demand to stop these horrors. Judging by his words, he is under a fly, and there is some foul language about to be heard, so be careful. By the way, Drone arrivals have affected not only the work of military-industrial enterprises, but also Russian Moscow airports, where hundreds of people have already been stranded. Let me remind you that more than 60 flights were cancelled at Vnukovo, and another 52 were delayed for more than 2 hours. At another Moscow airport, hundreds of passengers are still queuing up to change their tickets. Let me show you a video of what the line to get into Vnukovo even after the airport was supposedly reopened. There are still traffic jams and lines of hundreds of Russians and lines trying to either change their tickets or get on their own flight. Let me remind you that on Sunday, he said that Russian President Vladimir Putin had lost his mind, and the day before he posted on Trust Social that Putin was playing with fire. The press release also contained insights that the current US president's administration was finally ready to impose tougher sanctions on Moscow.
Нагадаю, що у неділю він заявив, що російський президент Владимир Путін збожеволів, а напередодні надрукував у соцмережі Trust Social, що Путін грається з вогнем. І паралельно в американській пресі ширилися інсайди про те, що начебто адміністрація теперішнього президента Сполучених Штатів Америки нарешті готова ввести посилені санкції проти Москви.
And now for the reaction. Putin's aide Yuri Ushakov appeared in the media and talked to the host Pashko Zarubin, who asked him how he felt about Donald Trump's threats on social media. Ushakov replied that the current US president is not sufficiently informed about the so-called Russian-Ukrainian conflict. He noted that Trump does not make these statements in front of the camera, but he himself writes on social media that Putin is playing with fire and that Russia is sending drones to Ukraine for no reason. Ushakov added that they, of course, read and monitor all this. But in many respects, they conclude that Trump is not sufficiently informed about what is actually happening in the context of the Ukrainian-Russian confrontation. In particular, he is not informed about our response. At the same time, he apparently does not fully understand that we are only targeting military infrastructure or military-industrial complex enterprises. But the Kremlin's longtime mouthpiece, Vladimir Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov, decided to avoid commenting on the threats on social media altogether and said, "To be honest, I would not comment. It's clear that the American side is making significant efforts for a peaceful settlement, and President Trump personally wants a speedy settlement. And we reiterate that we are grateful for President Trump's personal mediation efforts."
мирного урегулирования американская сторона и лично президент Трамп хотят скорейшего урегулирования. И мы еще раз повторяем, мы признательны за посреднические усилия президента Трампа лично.
At the same time, there are clearly a lot of nuances to be discussed that cannot be sacrificed, and neither side will make concessions to its national interests. Just like the United States, Russia has its own national interests, which are above all else, just like their president. At the same time, Peskov spoke to the TASS news agency, where he said that the negotiating teams of Moscow and Kiev are currently developing a list of conditions, quote, for a temporary truce. He also claimed in a conversation with journalists that work on a Russian memorandum on the war in Ukraine was in its final stages, adding that Russia would not share the content of documents on the settlement of the war through the media.
При цьому заявив, що РФ не буде обмінюватися через медіа змістом документів щодо врегулювання війни.
Peskov claimed and urged Russian media to be careful with any publications, as there are many fakes or outright lies in the Western press. At the same time, the Kremlin's first secretary said that only Istanbul is currently being considered as a venue for future talks, and there will be no Vatican. Let me remind you that last week Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov opposed the Vatican option, saying that it would be inelegant for two Orthodox countries to discuss, and I quote, eliminating the root causes on a Catholic platform. This is a rather strange statement, given that the previous round of talks took place in Istanbul, Turkey, which is a Muslim country, and this did not prevent the two Orthodox states from communicating on this platform.
Від Лаврова, зважаючи на те, що що так званий раунд попередніх перемовин відбувся у Стамбулі, у Туреччині. А ця країна мусульманська. І от двом православним державам не завадило спілкуватися на цьому майданчику.
And for some reason, representatives of the Russian Federation are afraid to go to the Vatican. But let's get back to Vladimir Putin's national interests, which Dmitry Peskov told journalists today, and the ultimatums that may be spelled out in the future Russian memorandum. The Reuters news agency shed light on this situation today with its insights, which claim that in exchange for a ceasefire, Putin will demand the lifting of sanctions and a promise not to expand the North Atlantic alliance to the east. Also, according to these Reuters insights, the Russian president intends to obtain a written commitment from major Western powers to abandon the idea of NATO's eastward expansion. In addition, Putin is demanding that Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and other former Soviet Union countries be removed from the list of potential members of the alliance. Russia also plans to seek a neutral status from Ukraine, as well as, I emphasize again, the lifting of sanctions and the resolution of the issue of frozen Russian assets. At the same time, these insights say that if Putin realizes that he cannot conclude a peace agreement on his own terms, he will try to show both Ukrainians and our European allies through military victories that peace will be even more painful tomorrow. One source, speaking on condition of anonymity to Reuters, believes that if Putin saw a tactical chance on the battlefield, he would move further into Ukraine. According to this source, the Kremlin believes that Russia can fight a war with its hands, despite sanctions and economic losses. Another source told Reuters that Putin is now even less inclined to make territorial concessions and is sticking to his public position that all four Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, should go to Russia. As it is spelled out in such a piece of paper, no one needs it, like the Russian constitution. And these new demands of Putin's, which were disseminated by the Reuters news agency, are exactly at odds with the terms of peace that the Crimean dictator voiced in June 2024. Back then, the Crimean dwarf said that he was ready to stop hostilities if Ukraine refused to join NATO, as well as if Ukrainian troops withdrew from the entire territory of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kharkiv regions within their administrative borders. So far, neither Vladimir Putin nor his so-called team has demanded that other countries refuse to join the alliance in the course of negotiations with Kiev. However, they were voiced shortly before the full-scale invasion and were spelled out in December 2021 by the Russian Foreign Ministry, which then published a draft agreement between Moscow and NATO. And the same draft stipulated that the countries that were members of the alliance as of May 27, 1997, would refuse to deploy military and weapons on the territory of other European countries, except for those that were there as of the same year, 1997. Let me remind you that after 1997, the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, and the Balkan countries joined the North Atlantic Alliance. Croatia, Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria, and later Finland and Sweden joined after the full-scale invasion. Putin's demands include revisiting the 2008 NATO Bucharest summit decisions. Russian sources close to the Kremlin mention this. Recall that in 2008, NATO leaders in Bucharest supported Ukraine and Georgia's bids to join the alliance.
році у румунській столиці глави країн-учасниць НАТО заявили, що підтримують кандидатуру України та Грузії до вступу в альянс.
Vladimir Putin has repeatedly said that Western countries simply abandoned and deceived Russia by promising not to expand NATO to the east. Let me remind you that in 1990, Western diplomats allegedly promised the Soviet leadership that the alliance would not expand beyond Germany, but there was no written agreement to that effect and no evidence to support these promises. I frankly doubt that anyone among our European allies and in the North Atlantic Alliance will listen to these ultimatums, demands, and whims of the Kremlin. Speaking of the former, today President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky met with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in Berlin. The main topics of the visit were supplies, the expansion of Berlin's military assistance to Kyiv, and efforts to establish a ceasefire. After his meeting with Zelensky, Merz spoke to journalists and announced that today the German and Ukrainian defense ministers would sign a statement of intent to purchase long-range systems made in Ukraine. In order not to distort the words of the German Chancellor, I will quote them. There will be no restrictions on long-range weapons. Ukraine will be able to fully defend itself and hit military targets outside the territory of Ukraine, that is, on the territory of the Russian Federation. I will not say about our support, says Merz, but the assistance will be expanded. At the same time, the German Chancellor ignored the topic of providing Ukraine with German Taurus missiles, and did not mention it at all. Later, the German Ministry of Defense announced that the head of this department, Boris Pistorius, and Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustam Umerov signed an agreement on Berlin's financing of the production of long-range weapons on our territory. This agreement also provides for $5 billion in support from the German government. Earlier, before the meeting between Merz and Zelensky in Berlin, there were insights from the Bild magazine that reported that Germany would not provide Ukraine with Taurus missiles because the government there considers this topic, and I quote, too militant. And yet, at the time, Bild wrote that Merz was not going to let Zelensky go to Ukraine empty-handed, and that Germany was expected to provide Ukraine with additional Mars 2 systems with a range of up to 85 kilometers. This weapon is an analog of the American MLRS multiple launch rocket system. Let me remind you that similar systems were already delivered in 2022. In addition, additional deliveries from Berlin are possible. GPS guidance for M30 and M31 missiles, which, as the media noted, despite the fact that the Russians have learned to successfully counteract this technology. Finally, Bild's insight suggests that the German government also expects to provide indirect support to Kyiv. This includes funding for the Ukrainian defense industry and, in fact, the allocation of large sums for the development of Ukraine's own missiles, with a range of up to 2,500 kilometers. By the way, Merz's decision to lift the restrictions on the use of long-range weapons, i.e., to allow strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation, provoked a violent reaction in the Kremlin. First, Dmitry Peskov, a longtime Kremlin spokesman, took to the media and said the following: Merz's statement about long-range weapons is nothing more than further provocation of war. More radical was the longtime propagandist Margarita Simonyan, who responded in fact to Merz's threats and decision. I quote, "In Moscow's offices, they are discussing that if the German military hits Moscow with German weapons, we will have no choice but to hit Berlin." These are the threats made by Margarita Simonyan, and they practically duplicate the loud statements of another Kremlin official, the so-called media journalist Vladimir Salayev, who has repeatedly said that it is necessary to strike at the capitals of European countries that provide military assistance to Kyiv. In addition, not only the swamps were rattled, but also the representative of the pro-Russian far-left Alliance Party, Sarah Wagenknecht, who is now calling for a referendum in Germany amid debate about further arms supplies to Ukraine without range restrictions. And let me remind you that this same Sarah is a pro-Kremlin politician and is called, in principle, Vladimir Putin's girlfriend. Let me quote Wagenknecht. "The Chancellor's arms pivot is completely irresponsible. If German weapons, possibly Taurus missiles in the future, hit Russian cities, it would be tantamount to declaring war on Moscow." As we can see, she practically duplicates Margarita's words, and the head of the far-left alliance also expressed suspicion that the German government could have already supplied cruise missiles to Ukraine. Such treatment of the German population, which will have to bear the consequences, is absolutely unacceptable. A referendum should be held on Germany's policy towards Ukraine, especially on the ban on the supply of Taurus missiles.
Необхідно провести референдум щодо політики Німеччини в Україні, особливо щодо заборони на постачання ракет Таурус.
And dear friends, to the last topic announced for today about American senators. The day before, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham went on the air and said that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin simply does not want to end the war. And in this context, speaking to journalists, he recalled Russia's war crimes in Syria and emphasized that the Kremlin is now doing the same with regard to Ukraine. Let me quote Graham. We have to remember that this is a man who assisted the Assad regime in dropping lit bombs from helicopters on innocent civilians and hospitals in Syria. This barbaric behavior continues in Ukraine, the senator said. In addition, Graham called on Russians to realize that Putin is pulling them into the abyss. I will also quote this message so as not to distort his words. I am addressing the Russian people. Putin is leading you into the abyss. You, the Russian people and military, can do better. It's a rather infantile, childish, incomprehensible appeal and call from Graham on the fourth year of the full-scale invasion for the Russian military to turn their guns and weapons in a completely different direction, not towards Kyiv and Ukrainian territories, but towards some bunker where Vladimir Putin is sitting. This is the fourth year of the war. Yes, there are Russians who do not agree with the Kremlin's policy, but they do nothing about it, except for some meetings in the European Union and summits that have no effect on anything.
Іде четвертий рік війни, так, є росіяни, які не погоджуються із політикою Кремля, але при цьому нічого для цього не роблять, окрім якихось зібрань на території Європейського Союзу і проведення самітів, які на ніщо не впливають.
For example, Yulia Navalnaya is doing this. As for Lindsey Graham in Ukraine, in addition to words, he takes actions and concrete steps. A bill has been registered in the Senate that was drafted by Lindsey Graham in collaboration with Democrat Richard Blumenthal, and it provides for new sanctions against Russia, as well as high import duties on products from countries that buy oil, gas, and uranium from Moscow. It is envisaged that a 500% duty will be imposed on all goods from these countries that purchase the listed resources from Russia. This list may include China and India. If the bill is implemented, it will effectively mean a complete embargo on goods from these countries. According to preliminary information, 81 senators out of 100 have already supported this idea, and now they are waiting for the green light from the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump.
81 сенатор підтримав цю ідею зі 100. І тепер чекають зеленого світла від президента Сполучених Штатів Америки Дональда Трампа.
Second, the important news. We continue supporting Ukrainian forces. On May 6th, Vasyl Dovbush, call sign Golden, was killed in the Sumy sector. Vasyl was a former Channel 24 cameraman, IT specialist, biker, and music lover, devoted to his work. We're raising 350,000 UAH to repair and re-equip an armored vehicle for his crew. Please help via the link or QR code on your screen. Thank you for your support.